In the damp, gray winter of 1637, in a tavern in the Dutch city of Haarlem, history's first great financial bubble was about to pop. The air, thick with pipe smoke and the scent of beer, had for months buzzed with a singular, intoxicating word: tulips. But on this day, the buzz had died. A merchant stood before a gathered crowd, holding a contract for a rare Viceroy tulip bulb. He called out a starting bid of 1,200 guilders, a sum that could feed a family for a decade. The room was silent. He dropped the price. More silence. A cold dread, sharper than the North Sea wind, began to seep into the hearts of every man present. This is where our story culminates, but it began decades earlier in a world intoxicated by possibility. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century was the Silicon Valley of its age, a newly independent mercantile superpower. Its fleets dominated global trade, its banks pioneered modern finance, and its citizens enjoyed a standard of living unimaginable elsewhere. Wealth was not just for the aristocracy. It was within reach of merchants, craftsmen, and even farmers. This unprecedented democratization of prosperity created a fertile ground for a new kind of alchemy, turning money into more money, not through labor, but through speculation. It was into this world of boundless optimism and liquid capital that a beautiful, fragile object from the East inserted itself. The stage was set not for a simple economic event, but for a profound psychological drama, a mass hallucination of value that would define the very concept of a bubble for centuries to come. We are about to dissect Tulip Mania, an episode so iconic it walks the line between history and myth. Our journey will unravel how a biological organism became a financial instrument, how taverns became stock exchanges, and how collective greed can warp the very fundamentals of price and value. This is the archetypal story of boom and bust, and its echoes can be heard in every market crash that followed. The tulip's journey to the heart of a financial hurricane began not in a bank vault, but in the rocky foothills of Central Asia and the ornate gardens of the Ottoman Empire. The flower, whose name derives from the Persian word for turban, dulband, was a celebrated symbol of paradise and perfection in Islamic art and culture. Sultans hosted lavish tulip festivals, and the most prized varieties were those with vivid, sharp streaks of color on a pure white or yellow background, patterns known as breaks. For centuries, this was a purely aesthetic pursuit. The flower arrived in Western Europe in the mid-16th century, brought by Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, the Habsburg ambassador to Constantinople, who described them in letters that piqued European curiosity. They were first treated as exotic botanical rarities. The pivotal figure was Carolus Clusius, the preeminent botanist of his day. In 1593, he took a position at the newly established University of Leiden and planted a small, personal collection of tulip bulbs in the Hortus Botanicus. He was fascinated by their cultivation and the mysterious, unpredictable breaking of colors. Clusius was a purist, guarding his bulbs jealously. When local gardeners reportedly stole some, it inadvertently created the first illicit tulip market in Holland. The key to the tulip's future value was discovered, though not understood. The sublime breaks were actually the symptom of a mosaic virus, the tulip breaking virus, which weakened the bulb while creating its stunning, unique patterns. This viral infection made the most beautiful tulips also the most fragile and difficult to reproduce reliably. Thus, the fundamental market conditions were established: high demand driven by beauty and status, and a severely limited, unpredictable supply. Initially, the tulip was a plaything for the ultra-wealthy and the intellectually curious, a living jewel. But as the Dutch economy boomed, a growing class of wealthy merchants, the nouveau riche, sought symbols to display their success. The tulip, rare and visually stunning, was perfect. A single bed of prized broken tulips in your garden was a more powerful statement of wealth than a gold chain. The flower had successfully transitioned from a botanical specimen to a Veblen good, an item for which demand increases because its high price makes it a status symbol. The groundwork for speculation was laid not by financiers, but by social climbers and horticulturalists. In modern finance, we speak of intrinsic value, what an asset is fundamentally worth based on its cash flows or utility. What, then, was the intrinsic value of a tulip bulb in 1635? For a common bulb that produced a solid red flower, It was modest, the pleasure of a spring bloom. But for a broken bulb like the famed Semper Augustus or Viceroy, the calculation was alchemical. Its value was a complex cocktail of aesthetics, scarcity, and reproductive potential. The breaking virus meant these bulbs were slow to propagate. A mother bulb might produce only 2 or 3 offsets, clone bulbs, in a year, and there was no guarantee the offsets would carry the same prized pattern. This created a natural supply bottleneck. Furthermore, the bulb itself was a form of biological futures contract. When you bought a rare bulb in the summer after it was lifted from the ground, you were not just buying the physical object, you were buying the future offsets it would produce in the coming years. A single Semper Augustus bulb was, in essence, a factory for potential future wealth. This transformed the tulip from a consumer good into a capital asset. Its value was based on a speculative projection of its future offspring and their future market price. This psychological shift was critical. People were no longer trading in flowers. They were trading in promises and probabilities. The language of the market began to change. Bulbs were given heroic, aristocratic names like Admiral or General. Prices were quoted not just in guilders, but in bundles of goods, revealing their perceived worth in the real economy. A single bulb for a wagon load of wheat, rye, and cheese. Another for a suite of fine furniture. The most famous, for a luxurious canal house in Amsterdam. This practice of valuation in kind underscores a crucial point. At its peak, the tulip was not just a parallel currency. It was a supercurrency, deemed more valuable and liquid than the goods that sustained daily life. The market had successfully performed an alchemical feat. It had taken a perishable, seasonal plant and, through collective belief, imbued it with an intrinsic value derived entirely from its potential for capital appreciation. The line between a flower and a financial derivative had been irrevocably blurred. As mania took hold in 1635 to 36, the informal trade among gardeners and connoisseurs could no longer contain the frenzy. A formalized marketplace emerged, but it looked nothing like the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which dealt in sober shares of the Dutch East India Company. The tulip market found its home in the back rooms of taverns and inns across Holland, particularly in Haarlem and other flower-growing regions. These informal trading clubs were called colleges. Their rules were simple. A notary or a respected local would often preside. Sellers would list their bulbs or, more commonly, their contracts for bulbs. Buyers would bid. A deal was sealed with a handshake and a small premium paid to the tavern keeper, called wine money. This was the birth of a sophisticated, yet utterly unregulated, futures market. Here's the critical mechanism. The actual tulip bulb remained in the ground from June to September. For the other 9 months of the year, what was traded was a piece of paper, a promise to buy or sell that bulb at a fixed price upon its summer excavation. This meant a bulb could be sold and resold dozens of times while it slept beneath the winter frost. You could buy a bulb in November, sell the contract for a profit in December, and never intend to plant a garden. This was pure speculation, decoupled from the physical object. The market operated on margin in all but name. A buyer only needed a small deposit to secure a contract, betting on rising prices before the final settlement. This leverage amplified gains on the way up and would magnify the devastation on the way down. The social atmosphere of the tavern fueled the fire. In the warmth, among peers, with alcohol lowering inhibitions, the stories of overnight fortunes grew taller. The greater fool theory became the operating principle. You didn't need to understand the tulip's value. You only needed to find someone who would pay more for it tomorrow. The colleges democratized speculation. Weavers, cobblers, carpenters, and chimney sweeps liquidated their tools and livelihoods to buy a scrap of paper promising a flower. The entire structure was a masterpiece of financial innovation and social fragility, built not on stone, but on a shared, intoxicating belief that the music would never stop. To grasp the sheer scale of the irrationality, we must anchor the abstract prices in the concrete reality of 17th-century Dutch life. The currency was the guilder. A skilled craftsman, a carpenter or a silversmith, earned about 300 guilders per year. A fattened pig cost 30 guilders. A ton of butter, 100 guilders. A magnificent, gabled house on the Harengracht, Amsterdam's most prestigious canal, could be purchased for 10,000 guilders. Now, Consider the recorded sale prices from the peak of the mania in late 1636 and early 1637. A single Viceroy bulb, for 1,200 guilders. A Semper Augustus bulb, 5,500 guilders. Not a shipment, not a crate, a single bulb. One transaction recorded the sale of a rare bulb for a staggering bundle of goods, 2 lasts of wheat, valued at 448 guilders, for lasts of rye, 558 guilders, 4 fat oxen, 480 guilders, 8 fat pigs, 240 guilders, 12 fat sheep, 120 guilders, 2 hogsheads of wine, 70 guilders. Tulip mania endures because it is not an economic anomaly, but a psychological blueprint. It provides a pristine case study in the cognitive biases that drive speculative bubbles, biases that are hardwired into human nature. First and foremost is the fear of missing out, FOMO. When the cobbler sees the baker make a year's wages in a week by trading paper promises for flowers, his own honest trade feels like poverty. The social pressure to participate becomes unbearable. In a society as mercantile and status-conscious as the Dutch Republic, sitting out the mania was a form of social and economic suicide. This was amplified by social proof, the powerful heuristic that if everyone is doing something, it must be correct. The colleges were not full of fools. They were full of respected community members, creating a powerful echo chamber of validation. Recency bias played its part. Memory is short. For a young trader in 1636, tulip prices had always gone up. The concept of a crash was not in their lived experience, making the uptrend seem like a permanent law of nature. Furthermore, the narrative was irresistibly compelling. It was a story of democratized wealth, of beauty translated directly into capital, of a new, exciting game that bypassed the slow grind of traditional commerce. This narrative was reinforced by overconfidence bred from early, easy wins. A small initial speculation that paid off handsomely convinced the trader of his own genius, not his luck, leading to riskier bets. Finally, there was the disposition effect in reverse, the tendency to sell winning investments too early and hold on to losers. In the tulip market, the overwhelming drive was to hold, as selling meant capping your potential gains in a market that seemed to have no ceiling. This collective psychology created a perfect storm. Rational calculation was suspended not because people were stupid, but because the social and emotional rewards for believing in the bubble, the sense of belonging, the thrill of the gamble, the vision of a transformed future, overwhelmed the quiet voice of caution. The market became a place where dreams were priced, and for a brief, glorious moment, those dreams seemed to be the most valuable commodity on earth. Bubbles do not deflate slowly, they rupture. The trigger is often mundane, a pinprick in an overinflated balloon. For tulip mania, the traditional date of collapse is February 3, 1637. The location was Haarlem, a major center of the tulip trade. The event was a routine auction. But on this day, for reasons still debated by historians, the buyers failed to appear. Perhaps it was a local shock. An outbreak of the bubonic plague had been reported, causing sensible people to avoid crowded taverns. Perhaps the harvest of a key crop had failed, tightening cash. Perhaps the price had simply reached a level where the last willing and able buyer had made his purchase. Whatever the catalyst, the result was the same. A lot of prized bulbs found no bidder. The silence in that room was more powerful than any crash. In a market built entirely on confidence, the failure of a single auction was a catastrophic failure of faith. News traveled slowly but fatally. Within days, the contagion of doubt spread from Haarlem to Amsterdam, from Utrecht to Leiden. A paralyzing question replaced the frenetic bidding. If he couldn't sell his bulbs, can I sell mine? The answer, rippling outwards, was a resounding, silent no. Liquidity vanished instantly. Sellers who had counted paper fortunes found themselves holding unsellable contracts. Buyers who had promised fortunes faced ruin upon settlement. The chain reaction of defaults began. The complex web of promises that constituted the market unraveled with shocking speed. The tavern colleges, once roaring with activity, fell silent. The game was unequivocally over. The most poignant victims were the small-time speculators, the craftsmen and farmers who had sold their tools and livestock to enter the market at its peak. Their ruin was absolute. For the wealthier merchants, the losses were staggering but not fatal. The speed of the collapse is a key feature of a leverage-driven bubble. When the only reason to hold an asset is the expectation of selling it to someone else at a higher price, the greater fool theory. The disappearance of new fools causes the price to fall not to its intrinsic value, but to zero. The tulip's price did not find a floor at the value of a flower. It fell through it, into the realm of broken promises and shattered trust. The crash of February 1637 did not, as some popular histories suggest, plunge the entire Dutch Republic into a lasting depression. The core economy, its shipping, its textile industry, its global trade, remained robust. The crisis was largely contained within the speculative community. However, the social and legal fallout was immense and fascinating. A tangled knot of contracts now existed where Party A had promised to pay Party B thousands of guilders for a bulb now worth 100. If enforced, these contracts would have bankrupted thousands and could have caused a wider credit crisis. The Dutch authorities, famed for their pragmatic mercantilism, intervened not to bail anyone out, but to untie the knot. City councils, most notably in Amsterdam, essentially declared a legal force majeure. They ruled that contracts could be voided if the buyer paid the seller a small penalty fee, typically 3.5% to 10% of the contract price. This was a brilliant compromise. It prevented a cascade of bankruptcies that would have frozen the wider economy, while acknowledging that the contracts had been made in a state of collective delusion. Sellers, though furious, received some compensation and avoided a futile legal battle. Buyers were saved from financial obliteration. The market's response was a collective sigh of relief, mingled with bitterness. The episode left a deep cultural scar. The tulip, once a proud emblem of Dutch prosperity, became a symbol of folly and empty vanity. It featured prominently in the Sinken, still life paintings of the era, often depicted wilting or with insects crawling on it, a memento mori warning of the transience of worldly treasures. Satirical pamphlets, prints, and plays mocked the florists who had lost their shirts. A new phrase entered the lexicon, to have tulips in the head, meaning to be crazy. The pragmatic Dutch had experimented with the outer limits of speculation, learned a painful lesson, and incorporated it into their national identity as a cautionary tale. The market had self-corrected, not through a miraculous return to sanity, but through legal and social mechanisms designed to limit the collateral damage of mania. The story of Tulip Mania as a catastrophic national frenzy was immortalized not by 17th-century historians, but by 19th-century moralists. The most famous account comes from Scottish journalist Charles Mackay's 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Mackay, writing to entertain and moralize, painted a picture of a whole nation gone mad, with bulbs traded for estates and futures traded by every layer of society. His vivid, exaggerated narrative captured the public imagination and became the accepted history. However, modern economic historians, notably in Goldgar in her meticulous work Tulip Mania, Money, Honor, and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age, have challenged this caricature. Their research, based on archival records of actual contracts and court proceedings, suggests the mania was more contained. They argue the participants were not the whole populace, but a specific subset of wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen who could afford the risk, centered in a few cities. The total economic damage was limited, and the famous trades for houses were likely allegorical tales or isolated anomalies. This scholarly revision is crucial, but it risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The psychological truth of Mackay's narrative remains potent and important. Even if only 1% of the population actively traded, the social contagion, the price movements, and the pattern of boom and bust were very real. The modern view doesn't disprove the bubble, it refines its scale and mechanism. It shows that a bubble doesn't require the participation of every last citizen. It only requires a critical mass of speculators with access to credit or promises in a market with no fundamentals. The tulip mania myth persists because it is a perfect allegory. It simplifies a complex financial event into a powerful story with a clear moral, that greed can make societies chase worthless objects. This allegory has been invoked in every subsequent bubble, from Beanie Babies to Bitcoin. Whether the historical reality was slightly less dramatic than the myth is almost beside the point. The myth itself has become a financial instrument, a tool we use to understand our own recurring folly. So, what is the core secret, the timeless lesson of the tulip? It is not simply bubbles happen. The secret is understanding the anatomy of narrative-driven value. In 1637, the narrative was about beauty, rarity, and social ascent. Today, narratives surround blockchain decentralization, AI singularity, or the infinite growth of tech platforms. The pattern is identical. A compelling story creates a vision of a future state so desirable that it justifies prices detached from present reality. The tulip teaches us to perform a simple but vital diagnostic. Is this asset valued for what it does, or for the story about what it might become? A tool generates utility, a story generates speculation. When the story becomes the primary driver of price, you have entered tulip territory. The second lesson is about market structure. The tavern colleges created a frictionless, leveraged, self-referential trading environment. Compare this to modern crypto exchanges, meme stock platforms, or app-based trading with instant margin. Technological ease amplifies psychological bias. The final, most personal lesson is about self-knowledge. The Dutch craftsman who sold his tools did not just make a bad trade. He abandoned his core competency, his source of true, intrinsic value, to chase a phantom. In our age, this translates to the investor who abandons a diversified, long-term strategy to wallow their life savings into a trending asset. The tulip's ultimate secret is a warning against betting your castle, your security, your skills, your sanity on a flower, no matter how beautiful its story. True wealth is built on productive assets, durable skills, and rational patience. The castles still stand in Amsterdam. The Semper Augustus is extinct. From an Ottoman garden to a Haarlem tavern, the tulip's journey reveals the perpetual cycle of greed, fear, and narrative that drives financial extremes. If this deep dive into the mechanics of mania gripped you, prepare for our next investigation. We're opening the files on John Law and the Mississippi Bubble, a story where the stakes were even higher, involving a kingdom, a printing press, and a fugitive financier who nearly destroyed France. The blueprint of the tulip was used to build an even grander, more dangerous illusion. Subscribe to Blood Money Files and hit the notification bell. History's greatest financial secrets are waiting. Don't be left out of the story.